Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on the Wraithknight. Have you ever seen one of those celebrity clickbait articles about some child actor that you loved in 2001 who's in jail now for doing something that's like much less cute than he was as a 12-year-old? Or maybe you've paused in a supermarket checkout line to look at one of those trashy newspapers with an entire issue devoted to how some obscenely hot heartthrob from 2005 has experienced the ultimate tragedy of becoming a normal-looking human who lives in Tallahassee and is married to a horse dentist. Well, it's time for the Wraithknight to get that same treatment. The Wraithknight, the towering ghost titan that was the menace of the first months of the edition, has almost entirely disappeared from competitive play. So in this video, we're going to ask, where is he now? What has he been doing since he retired from being the most OP menace in all of 40K? Does he still have a place in a competitive list? Or is he best left to his own devices, living in Tallahassee, cheating on his horse dentist lover, and gambling away the proceeds of his former fame like the tragic subject of some low-budget biopic? It's a unit-focused video, people. I'm going to talk about the Wraithknight, and it's just a little bit different because it's the most mercurial unit in the index insofar as it was the best unit in the index in the beginning of the edition, probably the best unit in the whole game, and now it's like solidly B-list and doesn't really make it into competitive lists. But that said, I don't think the Wraithknight is bad. I think the Wraithknight is absolutely suitable for club play, store tournaments, mid-table play, and if you just build it the right way and run it the right way, you can still run your Wraithknights unless you're trying to win a GT, in which case I don't advise it. But two of the builds don't suck, despite the fact that this unit has had, I think, 2 nerfs to its rules. There was 1 nerf to the overall game rules just to stop the Wraithknight, and it's been wildly increased in points to 510, but it's still solid. In unit focus videos, I talk about what the unit is, its role on the table, obstacles to using it effectively, and how to play around those obstacles. So that's what we'll do. We'll also talk about best loadouts. Let's start with what is a Wraithknight. So for you newer players who don't know lore, the Wraithknight is the only Titanic non-Forge World Eldari pick. It's one of maybe 3 or 4, depending on where we draw the line, true bully units. A bully unit is like a durable unit that you can move into the midfield and uses like a deterrent, and you're not worried about it taking some damage. It can get really aggressive. It's one of only a handful of bully units available to Eldari, and really it's a target a limb unit. It's for killing stuff, predominantly for destroying tanks, monsters, and heavy infantry. But it's a target a limb unit, which can also take a punch, which is kind of unusual for Space Elf units. And then lore-wise, it's got a pretty cool grimdark backstory. So unlike the other Wraith infantry, which are all just a Spirit Stone plugged into a Wraith construct, a Wraithknight is a Spirit Stone plugged into a Wraith construct, but also a living pilot, and they have to have some deeply meaningful connection. Think like lovers or twins. And in some of the lore, it suggested that sometimes when Eldari need Wraithknights, they like off a twin. It's implied, which is creepy and grimdark and cool and very consistent with the overall 40K aesthetic. At least in some of the lore, like 40K lore contradicts itself, which is neat. I like that about it. It's like different medieval manuscripts telling you different things about the 13th century. It's fun. In at least some of the lore, Wraithknights were developed specifically to invade crone worlds, which are demon worlds that were the original, the planets that made up the original Eldari Empire, and since the birth of Slaanesh are now like demon haunted and terrible. So Wraithknights were built to like fight greater demons. So when Eldari go to crone worlds to find relics and spirit stones and cute pictures of grandpa, they have a Titanic ghost monster with them that can fight keepers of secrets and great unclean ones and Big Bird if it shows up. So the Wraithknight is a targetable and bully unit that wants to take away your opponent's most important toys and help you control the midfield. Let's take a look at its data sheet, its possible loadouts, and then talk about how to most effectively do that in an edition in which the Wraithknight is significantly less potent than it used to be, despite still having the same stats. So it's got a 10-inch move, which is fabulous, quite quick. T12, solid but not amazing for a unit of its cost. 2-up save, good, very good. No invuln if it doesn't have its scatter shield, and it probably won't, but that's okay for reasons that I will get into when I talk about the scatter shield. 18 wounds, not amazing for a knight, but not bad because it has damage reduction. We'll talk about that. 6+ leadership. Okay, OC10. Yay, OC10 is good. Solid objective control for non-battle line infantry and non-infantry. It has 2 abilities. It's agile, which means that it can step over ruins that are up to 4 inches in height, and it can step over units when it moves around or falls back or advances or does move stuff. And it has a Wraithbone form, which means you get to subtract 1 from the damage characteristic of attacks that ding it. Not quite as amazing as what the Avatar does having damage, but really solid, really good. Particularly good into high volume, like flat 2 damage fire. It's really nice to be able to just cut that in half, but it's good. It makes up for the 18 wounds to some degree. And then it has the normal advantages and disadvantages of being a Titanic towering unit, which have changed since the beginning of the edition. So Titanic towering units, it can hide behind terrain. Yay. But it can no longer see everything on the battlefield just by virtue of being towering and Titanic. Reasonable. While narratively sensible, that was an overpowered mechanic at the beginning of the edition. Unlike tanks and monsters, if it's not totally in a ruin, if it just toes a ruin, if it steps into it a little bit, it can see everything on the other side of the ruin, as though it has cover, but it's like towing the ruin. It can be seen and it can see. Normally, if you park the front fin of a grav tank and a ruin, it can be seen, but it can't see. So this is theoretically better. Not theoretically, it is better. And then Titanic towering Wraithknight units can no longer trigger Overwatch, because it was completely overpowered in the beginning of 10th edition when you could trigger Overwatch with heavy Wraith cannons and automatically hit with Fate dice. Back when you could use any number of Fate dice and you could hit with crazy numbers of shots. That's not a thing anymore. No more Overwatch, Wraithknight. Sad. Which is one of the many reasons that the Avatar is a much more competitive include. The Avatar does most of the things that the Wraithknight does, but better for fewer points. Which is why, if you're running a Wraithknight instead of the Avatar, unless you're also running the Avatar, it's a narrative decision. Now, you can build a Wraithknight to be sufficiently different from the Avatar of Cain that it is not like running a shitty Avatar. And if you're going to run a Wraithknight, this is what I think you should do. And so we're going to talk about how to do that. But the Avatar of Cain is a A-list, very competitive midfield bully unit with badass melee and badass shooting, and it's incredibly durable. And the Wraithknight is a bully unit, a midfield bully unit that can have badass shooting and can have good melee and is durable for a lot more points, but is not as good. So let's just be clear that if you're including a Wraithknight, it's either because you're making a narrative choice, or because it's what you have in your collection, or because you already have the Avatar of Cain and you want to do some multi-threat durable bully list. And this is what you have in addition to the Avatar. So the Wraithknight becomes, it comes standard with a Titanic Ghostglaive, which is a very scary melee weapon that you probably shouldn't take, even though it's great, and a Scatter Shield, which is very good, but you probably shouldn't take, because for 510 points, you need better damage output than you can have with only a single arm. And the Titanic Ghostglaive takes up a slot that could be allocated, or I'm sorry, the Scatter Shield takes up a slot that could be allocated to a different heavy weapon. So the Scatter Shield gives you a 4-up invulnerable save, which is great. You give up one of your 2 slots for a really powerful weapon in exchange for a 4-up invulnerable save, which is great. But here's why I think you shouldn't take it. The Wraithknight has a 2-up save. So against weapons with -1 and -2 AP, it's still going to have a save at least it's not going to need its invuln. And if it's in cover, and kids, it's going to always be in cover because most of the time when it's not in melee, because it has such a big base, it's easy to put part of its base in or behind some ruin. So even against -3 AP, it's still going to have a 4-up save against shooting. Only when you get to -4 and better AP does the shield matter at all, usually the way the cover works out in non-melee combat, which is where it's most important to have the save for this unit. And so I think you're not going to want the shield. The glaive is good, and I think so. There's 4 possible builds for the Wraithknight, not including the ways you could swap out the shoulder weapons, which are kind of tertiary. And one of the 2 best ones does include keeping the glaive. I think it's the second most competitive of the 2, but the glaive is solid. The glaive is good. So the Titanic Ghost Glaive has 2 profiles. It has a strike profile with 5 attacks, hitting on 3s, but you have your reroll for the Warhost detachment. Strength 16. Ooh, good. -3 AP, solid. Flat 6 damage. Flat 6 is cool. On the one hand, it's not as good as like the Wailing Doom because you can't use a fate die to get to flat 8 damage, but you don't have to use a fate die to do a crap load of damage with the Titanic Ghost Glaive's strike profile, which is cool. That said, it's not quite as amazing as it sounds because if you're up against a really powerful melee unit monster thing, figure if it can be -1 to hit, you're going to hit 2 or 3 times, you're going to wound 1 or 2 times, and then maybe you're going to get 1 blow through and it's going to do flat 6 damage in melee against something that's like a really good dedicated melee bully unit, which is not really enough for a 510 point model, but against things that don't have invulns and can't reduce your probability of hitting, it's just going to eat them up, which is great. You'll also almost never get into those things against a good player. It also has a sweep attack with the Titanic Ghost Glaive, which is cool. It does 15 attacks, which is amazing. Hitting on 3s, strength 8. So we're wounding Space Marines on like 2s. So even against heavy infantry, it's badass. -2 AP, not -3, but you know, there's no cover in melee, so -2 is solid. Flat 2 damage with reasonably hot dice. You can put down 6 or 7 Marines and melee, which is good. With average dice, you'll put down 5 or 6 of them, which is still good. And then you have the opportunity to swap both of those out. The Scatter Shield can only be swapped for a Wraith Cannon. The Glaive can be swapped for a Sun Cannon or a Wraith Cannon. Let's talk about Wraith Cannons. So you can either have a Wraith Cannon and a Glaive, 2 Wraith Cannons, or because the Wraith Cannon can be swapped for a Sun Cannon, I'm sorry, the Glaive can be swapped for a Sun Cannon or a Wraith Cannon, you can have a Sun Cannon and a Scatter Shield. So the Wraith Cannon is probably the best weapon that the Wraithknight can have. It's so freaking good. You can have either one of these or 2 of these. It has a 36-inch range, D3 attacks, but blast, so D3 plus 1 against small squads and D3 plus more against big squads. Hitting on 3s. Strength 20, you heard me right, 20. -4 AP, 2d6 damage. Ooh, fun. So with a fate die, you can do 6 plus d6. And devastating wounds. So on 6s to wound, you just push 2d6 straight through the armor save, regardless of invulns. And I think you probably see how this works. If you're shooting something like a tank with a T12 tank with a 3-up armor save and no invuln, you're wounded in on 3s. You go straight through its armor and you do a crap load of damage. And if you have 2 Wraith Cannons, you're shooting at that target 2d3 times, which is a lot. You're almost certainly going to just blow it off the map. The same is true of most monsters. And the opportunity, again, to use, if you've got a nearby Farseer, to use any fate die roll to just push through 6 plus d6 damage, or to choose to ignore invuln saves, makes the Wraith Cannon fierce indeed. And 2 of these things makes the Wraithknight one of the most terrifying shooting units in the game, even now, even to this day, even post the nerfs into hard targets. And strength 20 is no joke either. It's wounding everything on at least a 3-up. And the fact that it has the blast keyword means that like into something like a squad of Terminators, if it's a big squad of like Chaos Terminators, you might be doing 2d3 plus 2 shots, hitting on 3s, wounding on 2s, taking them to their own vuln, and then just vaporizing them. And against a small squad, it's still 2d3 plus 2. So the Wraith Cannon's fabulous, objectively. It is. It's so good. I think 2 of these things is the most competitive build, in which case for melee, you're falling back on your Titanic feet, where you just step on dudes. You've only got 5 attacks hitting on 3s, but it's strength 8, so you can step on a Space Marine on a, you wound them on a 2-up, minus 1 AP, flat 2 damage. It's okay. It's not bad. Your other option is to take a Sun Cannon with a Ghost Shield, or you could take a Sun Cannon and a Wraith Cannon. I'm not a fan of the Sun Cannon. It has a 48-inch range, 2d6 shots, which is really swingy, hitting on 3s. Strength 8, which means it's really good into light infantry or like Space Marine level heavy infantry. Minus 3 AP, good. Flat 3 damage, good. I normally love flat 3, but I don't love it in this case for the simple reason that 2d6 is so swingy, and strength 8 means against hard targets, you're still only wounding on 5-up. And I just like the 2d6 thing. I just don't love that you can roll a 3 on that, and your 510-point model, especially if you take it with a freaking scatter shield, your 510-point model can end up shooting like 3 shots that hit on 3s, and into something like what it would want to shoot, like Space Marine Terminators. You hit twice and they save once, and you kill one with your 510-point model, and that's just not good enough. So I'm not a fan of the Sun Cannon. And then if you have to target tanks and monsters, having 2d6 shots is super swingy, and only wounding on 5s is super swingy. It's just not. It's not a reliable build. On the shoulders, you can either have 2 scatter lasers, 2 shuriken cannons, or 2 star cannons. I'm a star cannon guy for the Wraithknight. The star cannon, I assume you know what these things do. The star cannon has a scatter laser, is a bunch of shots with no AP and only 1 damage. Good against stuff like termagants, and if you don't have swooping hawks and warp spiders and other shit in your list like that, then yeah, I guess you take them, but you should have those other things in your list to control points and score secondaries. So you already have infantry elimination covered, so you're either taking twin or double star cannons or double shuriken cannons. I like the star cannon because on turn 1 the Wraithknight is probably not in range to use the 24-inch range on the shuriken cannon, and it's 4 shots instead of 6 shots. It doesn't have sustained hits, but strength 8 is better than the strength 6 on the shuriken cannon. I love the minus 3 AP flat 2 damage. I love the minus 3. It's just, if you need to do a couple extra wounds to a really hard target, you shoot it with all your star cannon shots, you probably get 2 through, and if you need to kill some Space Marines, it's really good at that. If you own a Wraithknight and it's not built with star cannons, don't worry about it. This is kind of a trivial decision. And shuriken cannons are definitely good. I recommend the star cannon. So the takeaway is this. I think there's 2 really good builds for the Wraithknight. The most competitive is a pair of Wraith cannons. And if you're going to do this, there's a way that you play it. And the other one is a Wraith cannon and a Titanic Ghost Glaive. And if you're going to do this, there's a way that you play it. I think that's the number 2. They both involve hiding your Wraithknight on turn 1, which you can do now since they changed the rules for Obscurian and Titanic units from the beginning of the edition. You hide it on turn 1, and then you get aggressive. And when you get aggressive and how you get aggressive depends on your build and what your opponent has. Okay, so here's where we are. There are 2 plausible builds for competitive play. One is double Wraith cannons, one is a Wraith cannon and glaive, and I've just said that they both play basically the same way, and here's what that means. So the Wraithknight, once again, it's a target elimination unit that is also a bully unit that gets you space in the midfield and lets you dominate an objective. Which means it can't just sit in your backfield. You have to get out there with the Wraithknight. Whether or not you get out there with a Wraithknight on first turn depends entirely on what sort of threats exist in your opponent's list. And this principle is going to require you to know some things about your opponent's units, like what you're playing into. But here's a good basic guideline. If your opponent has more than 6 weapons that could potentially get a line of sight on the Wraithknight that are at least strength 12, do D6 plus something damage, and have -3 or better AP, then it may make sense to remove some of your opponent's most dangerous units before you get really aggressive with the Wraithknight. So in competitive play, that's going to be into most lists. Before you get super aggressive with the Wraithknight, or on the same turn that you do, you may want to pick up like one significant threat if you can. Certainly into a list that's primarily a melee list, or that has 6 or fewer hard-hitting weapons that can get a beat on the Wraithknight, you can probably just get aggressive out of the gate. But here's how it works. You're going to move to the midfield with the Wraithknight when it is appropriate to become aggressive. You're going to dominate an objective. You're going to, if the Wraithknight has no melee weapons, screen it. And you're going to dominate some section of the field while eliminating hard targets using the Wraith Cannon, of which you will have at least one, with some combination of fate dice and general awesomeness. Trying to explain the flowchart of all of the various ways that this could work is too much for a video and would not be fun or interesting. But here are the general parameters. 1, the Wraithknight is either going to be completely ignored by your opponent, or it's going to take fire. Probably it's going to take fire. If it's going to take fire, you need to make it as durable as it can be. You probably want to put Fortune on it. T12 is great, but there are a lot of target elimination weapons in the game that are T12 or better. If you can make your opponent's target elimination heavy weapons wound you on 5s instead of 4s, that's considerable. So using a Farseer to put Fortune on the Wraithknight is really something. Also, having a Farseer close enough that you can use fate dice either for invulnerable saves or for guaranteeing that you get devastating wounds on something, or for doing D6 plus 6 damage is also essential. So the Wraithknight is going to need a Farseer within 12 inches. That's part of the build. Probably the way tournament terrain works, this means that you can have the Wraithknight in the midfield, partially obscured behind a piece of terrain, more or less controlling an objective, with excellent line of sight to most of your opponent's side of the field and plenty of targets, and within 12 inches of a Farseer that is at the front of your deployment zone, behind an opaque wall, probably in your deployment zone. That's the setup, people. You need a Farseer totally out of line of sight of your opponent, within 12 inches of your Wraithknight, so that you can manipulate fate dice and use anything as a 6, again, for the purposes of saving throws, damage, and devastating wounds, but also to throw Fortune on the Wraithknight to make it -1 to wound, because a Wraithknight that's -1 to wound is very difficult to deal with. That's huge. 2, one of the most efficient ways to destroy a Wraithknight is with high volume of attack, multi-damage, melee. And so if you're running the Wraithknight with double Wraith Cannons, you need to screen it. Now, screening means prevent it from being engageable by an enemy unit that's good at that. Like maybe your opponent doesn't have those units, maybe she does. One of the most convenient units for screening a Wraithknight is a unit of Banshees. I have a recent YouTube video about Banshees. They're only 70 points. They fight first, which is cool. They can get wherever they need to be. And there's a way to set this up where, like, if you're running the Wraithknight with the double Wraith Cannons, you keep the Wraithknight just far enough back from the piece of terrain that it's sort of behind, and the Banshees are just far enough in front of it that nothing can get to the Wraithknight without hitting the Banshees first. But the Banshees are still obscured by the terrain, so your opponent can't clear them with shooting. And then any infantry or whatever, like heavy infantry or characters or whatever, that charges through the terrain will hit the Banshees first, and they'll fight first. And that gives great cover to the knight. If your Wraith Knight needs to be able to see through that piece of terrain to shoot, then obviously maybe on the next turn, like, it tows the terrain to make that terrain disappear for purposes of visibility, and the Banshees have to step forward, and now the Banshees are targetable, and that's sad, but necessary. This is still not a bad build. If you're running a Wraith Knight with a glaive and a single cannon, your opponent might have really hard-hitting, good melee units, but the multi-classing into melee that the glaive gives you at the cost of one Wraith Cannon is solid. You're like pretty good at killing. You're pretty good at killing infantry of any stripe, and then if you can get aggressive into an opponent's monster or tank, that's good too. One thing you have to be a little bit careful about, if the Wraith Knight is also towing an objective, which is a good idea, and you screen it with something like Banshees, you don't want to get into a situation where your opponent can kill your Banshees in melee. Like maybe they engage the Banshees with something that's really good at fighting and hyper durable, so the Banshees do some damage, but then get wiped out, like Chaos Terminators. And then because your Wraith Knight is on an objective, your opponent can make a consolidation move into the Knight. Don't do that. Be careful about that. And incidentally, if you are going to run a single cannon and the glaive, I think the plan is not to just have the glaive as like a backup option in case you get engaged in melee, because you're literally cutting in half your shooting profile. So if you are going to go one Wraith Cannon and glaive, and I'm going to say again, I think that's the less competitive of the two builds, you have to plan on, after you stop on some midfield objective while screened by Banshees or whatever, you're going to keep going. You're going to like be really aggressive with this unit and like slam into your opponent and push the backfield. And if you are going to do that, really, if you're going to have any Wraith Knight in your list, if you're going to do that, you want to capitalize on the fact that your opponent is going to need to divert resources to killing the Wraith Knight. Here's what that means. Successful lists that are running a Wraith Knight are going to also have other anchor bully units, because one of the big advantages to running a Wraith Knight is with its damage reduction and its high toughness and its 2-up save and its 18 wounds, your opponent will have to devote most of her hard target elimination to getting rid of the Wraith Knight to avoid being totally dominated in the midfield by the unit, which means she won't have a lot of hard target elimination left over for other units in your list. I think the strongest possible Wraith Knight build is a list that has the Avatar of Cain and the Wraith Knight, because your opponent can't deal with both, probably, almost certainly. And then maybe even another triple threat unit, like the Wave Serpent with Yvraine in it and all the Harlequins, and Yvraine gives them a 5-up Feel No Pain, and she resurrects Harlequin models, and there are 11 of them in the Wave Serpent. Maybe with both the Avatar and the Wraith Knight, you can't afford that points-wise. You could even just run those on foot, with or without the Vizark, behind the Wraith Knight, so that if your opponent does attempt to engage the Wraith Knight, you can counterpunch with this really powerful melee unit with crazy resurrection abilities. If you haven't already watched my video on the triple threat Aldari list, and you're thinking about doing this, I think you should. I talk about that combo with Yvraine and the Harlequins and why it's good. But the point here is, if you're running a Wraith Knight, you need a diversity of hard targets, because what you want to do is create an inefficiency in your opponent's list. That is, your opponent should find herself with insufficient hard target elimination if you're running a Wraith Knight to deal with your other stuff. So if you're running a Wraith Knight, probably you're running a relatively low model count, highly elite list. I like the Wraith Knight with the Avatar of Cain. I like the Wraith Knight with the Avatar of Cain and any grav tanks, Falcons with stuff in them. I like the Wraith Knight with the Avatar of Cain and Warwalkers, which I think are highly efficiently pointed. And I love the toughness reduction, the field on the Warwalkers. I think that's just so good. What you should not do is have only like very limited other tough stuff in your list and figure, well, I have the Wraith Knight, so now I'm going to run a bunch of infantry, so your opponent can focus on your Wraith Knight with literally everything in her list that is a hard-hitting multi-damage weapon, because now well, I think you see the issue, right? Make her make hard choices. So if you're running a Wraithknight, you're going to get aggressive into the midfield with it, either out of the gate or once you've eliminated one of your opponent's big threats to your hard targets with your various Eldar trickery. You have a lot of stuff that's fast that can get beads on your opponent's stuff. Like you can run some Skyweavers and move really far on turn 1 and get a bead and, you know, pick up a tank or something that would be good into the Wraithknight. There are other tricks. I've made a lot of videos. And then either when you've picked up one of those tools, or if your opponent doesn't really have enough tools out of the gate, you can get aggressive with the Wraithknight out of the gate. It moves into the midfield, and then you're running it in combination with a nearby Farseer who can throw Fortune on it, who can let it use Fate dice to auto-succeed on a saving throw. If your opponent has some weapon that hits really freaking hard, and your Wraithknight's getting targeted with that, by all means, you know, auto-succeed on a saving throw with a Fate die to make sure you just ignore that damage. Consider running it alongside an Avatar of King. Consider running it alongside of Falcons with stuff in there like Striking Scorpions, Fire Dragons. Those are the two best options for inside of Falcons. Screen with something. Fire Prisms go reasonably well with a Wraithknight and other, you know, hard targets. If you are an Eandon player, Eandon's in a little bit of a tough place right now, but that's like the Wraith heavy craft world. You could screen the Wraithknight. Your whole list would be constructed probably around your Wraithknight. You could screen your Wraithknight with some kind of Wraith infantry, run some Wraith Lords. I think that Wraith Lords are a solid B list include, but one of the advantage to having Wraith Lords alongside a Wraithknight is your opponent probably just doesn't have the firepower to challenge them. To shoot everything that's a hard target. But if you are running a Wraithknight, you should be planning on presenting your opponent with more incredibly durable stuff than she's going to have the tools to deal with. And you're going to beat her either by getting an advantage before you get super aggressive by using your maneuverable target elimination units to pick up some of her hard target elimination. So when you come out with your hard targets, you can't deal with it. Or you're going to look at her list and say, look, you just don't have enough hard target elimination to deal with my plethora of hard targets and get aggressive out of the gate. So the other thing that you're going to need in any list involving a Wraithknight is a bunch of scoring units. Units that are fast, that are good at eliminating hordes, because Wraithknights tend to not excel into that kind of thing. But mostly units that are fast and good for scoring. So Swooping Hawks have really good synergy here. Warp Spiders have really good synergy here. Individual Vipers actually have really good synergy here. Individual Vipers are cheap. They're a little bit tough. They're like, small arms are ineffective into them. Heavy weapons are a little bit of overkill, but if your opponent's killing a Viper, they're not shooting your Wraithknight with their las cannon or whatever. Skyweavers. I like Skyweavers in any list. They're fast. They're highly maneuverable. They have an invuln. They're weirdly durable. If you give them haywire cannons, they're incredibly good into opponent's armor. But you're going to need you need the Farseer to buff the Wraithknight. You need other hard targets, and you need scoring units. I think running 2 Wraithknights is kind of crazy. You can do it in highly casual or thematic play, but it's kind of crazy. I do think you want stuff that's fast and maneuverable that will be able to get the angles that you need to potentially, if your opponent is trying to, like, not knowing if she's going to get first turn, hide units that will be effective into your hard targets. Should you find yourself getting first turn, you should have a way to pop some of those. So one potential combo would be to run a couple of Fire Prisms and, like, have a Fire Prism move up the flank, but stay close enough to another Fire Prism that both can shoot from the perspective of the first Fire Prism to pop a thing, and then use Fire and Fade to make a full move with that first Fire Prism that moved totally out of line of sight. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, review the data sheet for the Fire Prism. 2 fire prisms, multiple fire prisms can shoot from the POV, point of view of a single fire prism, using various war gear abilities. And fire prisms are durable. That's another hard target. There's like interesting synergy there with a Wraithknight and some other super tough unit. Like in all Eldari lists, I think you want a Way Leaper because they generate CP for you. That's big. But I basically think you want to think of any list that involves running a Wraithknight a little bit like the triple threat Eldari list that I talked about in a recent video, where you're essentially saturating the midfield with threats that your opponent simply isn't going to have enough resources to deal with. And whether or not you do that out of the gate or on turn 2 after you've picked something up, it's just going to depend on what you're up against. If you do run the Wraithknight and the Avatar of Cain, you can split your durability tools in an interesting way. The Wraithknight is not, obviously can't use lightning fast reactions, which cannot be used on Wraith Infantry for thematically sensible reasons. Wraith constructs are not lightning fast, but you can use Fortune on the Wraithknight to make it extra tough and lightning fast on the Avatar to make it extra hard to hit, to give yourself extra durability presence in the midfield. I do think that if you're running the double Wraith Cannon Wraithknight, which like doesn't really want to be engaged in melee with the way rules work in 10th edition, something that's engaged in melee can still, like a tank or a monster or a Titanic unit that's engaged in melee can still shoot stuff. There's a penalty. You don't really want the penalty. So I do like in any unit running the Wraithknight with double cannons, I think it's cool to have a melee counterpunching unit. This is why I like the 10 Harlequins with Yvraine. That's both a durable unit and also a good melee counterpunching unit that can be used to like clear stuff off of the Wraithknight if your opponent tries to engage it. But whatever you decide to do, I think the most important thing is that you have really potent hard target elimination in the list, because the idea is you're going to take away in the first half of the game the tools that your opponent would use to eliminate stuff like the Wraithknight or the Avatar of Cain or your Wraith Lords that are running around if you're an Eandon player or whatever. You're going to take away those tools so your bully units can run roughshod over your opponent, and you're just going to keep up constant and intense pressure with these like very durable units such that your opponent cannot deal with it. But then you also need, of course, relatively cheap fast scoring units like Hawks and Warp Spiders and maybe Singleton Vipers, maybe Skyweavers, Shadow Specters, even small units of Wind Riders, stuff that can just be used to score, right? Like Pariah Nexus secondary missions. And that's pretty much what I've got on the Wraithknight. It's certainly not the tremendously OP clutch unit that it was at the beginning of the edition, and frankly I'm glad it's not. That was out of control. It was like not fun to be an Eldar player in the first 2 months of the edition because everybody hated us, understandably, largely because of Wraithknights. But on the other hand, I want the Wraithknight to still be good enough that it's viable and usable, and I try to be very positive in general about rules and GW on this channel. I will say that I think that the Wraithknight is currently overcosted by at least 60 points. And I think that it would be nice if the Shield and Glaive version of the Knight had a completely separate data sheet in the new codex. That would be awesome, because it just has no business costing the same points as a Wraithknight with double Wraith Cannons. But despite all that, it's still a good unit. I don't think it has a place in a top 3 GT list, but that doesn't mean it totally sucks. It's like a Wraithknight can still do very well for you in competitive games at your local club or in RTTs or store tournaments. It's a big investment, and you have to build around it. You've got to make it a priority. It's not a thing that you just throw in because you like it. It's 25% of your list. And in order for it to do its job and operate effectively, like 2/3 of the rest of your list construction has to be done around this like 510 points that you've already committed to. So I think like the good news is if you own a Wraithknight and you like your Wraithknight and you want to still use it, barring you being an ambitious grand tournament player, I think you can. The Wraithknight is not just a Tallahassee bound washed up former child star cheating on a horse dentist. It's a viable unit. The bad news is it is overcosted. And if you are hoping to go to the top 3 of a GT in the next few months before the Codex comes out, then probably this is not the pick for you. But I think for most of us, for the kind of Warhammer, the various kinds of Warhammer that most people are playing, you can totally run a Wraithknight and have it do good work for you. Just be realistic about the build. And don't be dumb. Definitely don't do this. Don't give it the Ghost Glaive and the Scatter Shield and just run at your opponent with it and be like, it's a big monster with a Ghost Glaive and a Scatter Shield. That's awesome. It'll do great. That way lies madness and disappointment. And don't just throw it in your list and disregard stratagems and not use the Farseer to give it fortune and forget about using fate dice to auto-generate devastating wounds. Or if you're not like using this unit in conjunction with other stuff and building around it, it will let you down for sure. But if you do make it the centerpiece of your list, I think you can expect good outcomes. So there it is, the Wraithknight in 10th edition, 40K. Not exactly a washed up celebrity story, but definitely a come down, and rightfully so, from where it started. Even if it's maybe a little bit excessive in terms of its the ways in which it's been reined in. So that's what I've got. I hope to be back again soon with something new. I'm going to keep hammering these unit focus videos for maybe a couple of more weeks, and then the closer we get to the few more weeks, the closer we get to the 9th edition, the 10th edition codex, excuse me, the more I'll shift towards lore and stuff that will continue to be relevant. Thank you as always to my sponsor, the Magnet Baron. You're fabulous. Thank you to my patrons. You're amazing. I especially enjoy interacting with many of you on Discord. If anybody's listening to this and is thinking, gee, I'd like to interact on Discord, for $3 a month or more, if you're feeling generous, you can become a patron. And I hope those of you who are patrons or not patrons or just listening to this will consider leaving a comment, maybe clicking like, maybe subscribing if you've not already done that. It really does help the channel. And it also just helps me stay motivated to keep making content. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I'll be back again soon with something new. Until then, take care. Bye.